Welcome to Talking History, a series of talks from the Farnham U3A World History Group. The views expressed in this talk are representative of the views held at the time of the material being discussed. They do not necessarily represent the views of the speaker, the Farnham U3A World History Group, nor the team at the Mr. T podcast studio. In this talk, Jo Watson tells us about the legendary French actress, Sarah Bernhardt.
This year marks the centenary of the death of one of the world's most charismatic actresses. This is quite a thing to say, but her name was Sarah Bernhardt, and she was the toast of not just France, Europe, and most of the rest of the world in the late 19th and early 20th century. Mark Twain once identified 5 kinds of actresses: bad actresses, fair actresses, good actresses, great actresses, and then there is Sarah Bernhardt. She was born Henriette Rosin Bernard in Paris in October 1844. She was the illegitimate daughter of one of the leading courtesans. Her father was later revealed to have been a lawyer in Le Havre who paid for her education and left her a tidy sum when she came of age. Her mother was largely absent, so she was sent to a Catholic boarding school, and after initially thinking she might become a nun, went in totally the opposite direction. Now, her mother had a lot of influential friends, including the half-brother of Napoleon III, the Duke of Mornay. It was his suggestion that Bernhardt should become an actress, and he took her to see her first play with a group of influential people. The teenager was overwhelmed with emotion and started to sob uncontrollably, which disturbed other audience members. But amongst the party was the celebrated author Alexandre Dumas Sr. Now, he was intrigued and arranged for her to audition for the Paris Conservatory. Here she changed her name to Bernhardt, and Mornay then arranged for her to join one of the leading theatres. And at the age of 18, she debuted in the title role of Racine's Iphigenia. Now, this was her first major performance, and it nearly ended her career as she got stage fright. A few months later, she got into a slanging match with one of the senior members of the company and was dismissed, and joined a troupe at a less prestigious theatre. Things looked up when she was invited to join them for a performance at Versailles for Napoleon and Eugénie, but naively her choice of poetry was by Victor Hugo, a notable critic of the Emperor's, which caused them to walk out. For a while she gave up the theatre and went travelling and spent some time in Brussels, where she had an affair with a prince. He wanted to marry her, but his family said they would disinherit him if he did. She returned to Paris and, unbeknownst to him, gave birth to their child, Maurice. She was still only 20. To support her son, she went back on the stage, initially playing small roles, but was an immediate hit with the audience of the Comédie Française. The director described her as a creature who was marvellously gifted, intelligent to the point of genius, with enormous energy under an appearance frail and delicate, and a savage will. The audiences were charmed, celebrities flocked to see and meet her, and artists to paint her. When her uninsured apartment burnt down in 1868, a star-studded benefit was given to raise money. Adelina Patti, the most famous singer of her generation, gave her services free, and it raised so much money that Bernhardt bought a bigger apartment and was able to employ some household staff. When the Franco-Prussian War broke out in 1870 and Paris was under siege, she organised the transformation of part of the theatre into a hospital. Here she would do some nursing and brought in her own chef to cook meals. Whether he resorted to serving zoo animals, which did happen, isn't clear. After the war, she didn't make an immediate return to acting, and when a new play was offered, she initially turned down the lead. When told they would offer the part to her main rival, she jumped off the sofa and said, "When do you start rehearsals?" From then on, she became a dominant figure in French theatre, endearing herself to audiences by her expressive voice and poetic gestures. Amongst those who came and were charmed by her was Bertie, the Prince of Wales, on one of his many visits to Paris. In 1873, with just 74 hours to learn the lines and practice the part, she played the lead in Racine's Phèdre, playing opposite a celebrated actor who soon became her lover. Phèdre was her most famous classical role. Very early on, she was aware that publicity was an important part of generating audiences, and she came up with a novel idea and backstory. She bought herself a made-to-measure pine coffin and would tell people she used to sleep in it on tour. Now, years later, she explained her reasons. I decided early on to nurture a reputation for eccentricity, ergo the coffin. I ordered my first one from a dear old carpenter in Belleville. At first, I used it as an item of furniture likely to attract attention and become a talking point. Then, after another brainwave, I had it fitted with a velvet lining and claimed falsely that I slept in it. When asked for a reason, I came out with the absurd explanation that when I had to die on stage, I slept in the sarcophagus to put me in the mood. I was amazed at how many people swallowed that crazy notion. The first time I did try to sleep in it, as a dare, I was uncomfortable and had to move to a proper bed in the middle of the night. Later, when my poor Jean, her sister who had TB, was dying, I got her moved to my rather small apartment so I could care for her. I did place the pine box beside her bed and slept there, but I did this out of necessity. I wanted to be able to attend to her when she woke up in the middle of the night. She later said she once made love in it to a Cuban matador, but it must have been a bit of a squeeze, and given her gift of embellishment, who knows if it was true. In 1879, she came to London with part of the Comédie Française company tour. Now, their tradition meant roles on the first night were done by seniority. Bernhardt was well down the batting order, but her reputation was as the star turn, so the theatre manager insisted she appear on the opening night. In a compromise, she performed one act of Phèdre between two traditional French comedies, including Le Misanthrope, so it must have been a very long night. In addition to her public performances, she also gave private recitals in the home of British aristocrats, arranged by a London impresario. He also arranged an exhibition of her sculptures and paintings in Piccadilly, which was attended by both the Prince of Wales and the Prime Minister, William Gladstone. Whilst in London, she attended to her personal menagerie of animals, purchasing 3 dogs, a parrot and a monkey, and made a side trip to Liverpool where she bought a cheetah, another parrot, a wolfhound, and received a gift of 6 chameleons, all of which she ultimately took back to Paris. Now, she was beginning to earn a lot of money, but was definitely a spender, not a saver. Part of her lavish expenditure was due to repeated conflicts with theatre owners who regularly sued her for breach of contract, and she was landed with heavy fines. In 1880, she was back in London with her own troupe, earning a hefty 5,000 francs per performance, plus a share of profits, and a substantial retainer designed to cover her most recent fine for walking out on a contract. Victorian England was more prudish than Paris, so she couldn't perform another of her most famous roles, The Lady of the Camellias, written by Alexander Dumas Jr., and that was because of the censorship rules. It's estimated she played this more than 1,000 times, and her speciality seemed to be playing tragic roles which regularly brought audiences to tears. When she returned to Paris, the Comédie Française asked her to come back, but she refused as she was now earning far more as her own boss, and instead took her new company and new plays on tour to Brussels, Copenhagen, and then around the French provincial cities. As soon as she'd finished that, she was off to the US with reputedly 60 suitcases, mainly, I imagine, of her own personal costumes. Now, audiences in New York lapped her performances, which, as ever, were all in French, and they paid up to $40 a ticket, which was an enormous amount at that time. Few in the audience understood French, but it wasn't necessary since her gestures and voice conveyed the meaning, and she received thunderous ovations. She thanked the audience with a distinctive curtain call. She didn't bow, but stood perfectly still, with her hands clasped under her chin or with her palms on her cheeks, and then suddenly stretched them out to the audience. After her first performance in New York, she took 27 curtain calls. Now, although she was welcomed by theatregoers, she was entirely ignored by New York high society, who considered her personal life scandalous. Her tour consisted of 157 performances in 51 cities. Now, to do this, she had a special train with her own luxurious palace car. She had 2 maids, 2 cooks, a waiter, her maître d', her personal assistants, and it also carried an actor named Edouard Angelo, who she had selected to serve as her leading man and, according to most accounts, her lover during the tour. She met Thomas Edison, who made a brief recording of her reciting a verse from Phèdre. Now, it must have been an exhausting trip as she crisscrossed the United States and Canada from Montreal and Toronto to St. Louis and New Orleans, usually performing each evening and then departing immediately after the performance. She gave countless press interviews and in Boston posed for photos on the back of a dead whale. She was condemned as immoral by the Bishop of Montreal and by the Methodist press, which obviously only increased ticket sales. All her tours gave her more opportunities to show her eccentricity, born out of an amazing imagination, as she later explained. These strange notions appear to me in a flash, just before I close my eyes at night, or just before I properly wake up. A hat with a stuffed bat as its motif, silk trousers and costumes for doing my sculpture in, jumping on ice floes in Canada, going for a swim in Copacabana in the flimsiest of swimming costumes. The first US tour lasted just over 6 months, and as she insisted in being paid in cash, she returned to Paris with a chest with $194,000 in gold coins. Now, despite that, the French gave her the cold shoulder, perhaps out of envy, so she returned to London and did later perform for Queen Victoria. Determined to be restored to popularity in France, she appeared at a benefit dressed as Les Marseillaise, recited the poem, waved the flag, and received a standing ovation. Her mantra was quand même, in spite of everything, the phrase she had embroidered on her linens, printed on her visiting cards, and engraved on her richly embossed revolver. Seemingly never content to stay in one place, she was off on her travels again, this time starting in Moscow, and then Spain and Austria, with the various heads of state amongst the audiences. The only European country where she refused to play was Germany, due to the German annexation of Alsace-Lorraine during the Franco-Prussian War. She took on more famous roles such as Cleopatra and Joan of Arc, but her entrepreneurial activities weren't quite so successful. Having leased a theatre for a new production, she gave the job of managing it to her 18-year-old son, who was totally unsuited to this role. He was also an inveterate gambler, so Sarah was continually having to bail him out. The first production was a new play called Fedora, with her new and only husband as the male lead. Although the critics were enthusiastic, one describing her performance as incomparable, a combination of extreme love, extreme agony, and extreme suffering. Sadly, not long into the run, her 8-month marriage collapsed. The production closed, and she lost a fortune she needed to give at the theatre, sell her jewellery, house, and horses. She was, however, indefatigable. More tours followed, 9 to the US alone. She also began taking on male roles, including a new version of Hamlet, with her in the lead. She also employed an up-and-coming artist, Alphonse Mucha, to design the posters, which became popular works of art in themselves. She did appear in a film, an early talkie, but admitted that her declamatory style of performance wasn't suited to this new medium. One of her favourite roles was La Tosca, which Puccini used for his opera. However, spoiler alert, those jumps off the battlements at the end were always a little risky, and she suffered a bad knee injury on her 1905 tour in Rio de Janeiro. Other injuries followed, and the leg never healed properly. She aggravated it several times, becoming increasingly frustrated by the amount of time she had to take off and rest. By 1915, gangrene had set in, and she asked her current lover, who happened to be a surgeon, to amputate her leg almost to the hip. It's said as they applied the anaesthetic, she went under singing the Marseillaise. Even this didn't stop her acting career. She tried several wooden legs, none of which met her requirements, and then resorted to using a custom-built sedan chair to be carried around in, and gave extracts rather than complete plays. Undeterred, Bernhardt continued to work, and in 1916 she began her final tour of the United States, which lasted until 1918. She continued to act until her death in 1923. She was actually even awarded the Legion d'Honneur despite her morals. Thousands came out to see her funeral procession. As for the amputated leg, it was supposedly kept in formaldehyde in a museum in Bordeaux, but it's now thought it can't have been hers, as it's a left leg, not the right one. So, as you see, she was a phenomenon, rather like a modern-day pop star, with the same fame, adoring fans, and foibles. Thank you.
This podcast has been produced by the Mr. T Podcast Studio in association with the Farnham U3A World History Group. Thank you very much for listening to this talk.